At first glance, this season looked like a dream come true. Every problem the WNBA had fought for decades to solve seemed to disappear all at once. Arenas were packed. Viewership records were being broken. Jerseys were selling out in minutes. Games that once struggled for attention were suddenly must-watch events on national television. To anyone watching casually, this felt like the moment women's basketball finally arrived. But inside the league, the mood was nothing like the celebration fans imagined. While highlights went viral and headlines praised growth, executives were dealing with something far more uncomfortable. The faster the league expanded, the more fragile everything started to feel. Meetings behind closed doors weren't about how big the league could become. They were about how exposed it suddenly was. Success didn't bring peace. It brought pressure. Because growth that happens too fast doesn't just elevate a league, it tests it. Every sold-out arena created new expenses. Every spike in attention increased security risks. Every viral moment raised expectations the system wasn't built to sustain. Infrastructure that had survived quietly for years was suddenly under a microscope, and cracks that used to be manageable became impossible to hide. Players felt that shift immediately. They could hear the noise, see the packed stands, feel the spotlight grow heavier, and yet their reality didn't change the way fans assumed it had. The rewards lagged far behind the attention. The league was louder than ever, but the benefits weren't evenly distributed. And that gap between perception and reality started to matter more than anyone expected. This story isn't about one bad season. It's not about a single contract dispute. And it's not about basketball decisions on the court. It's about what happens when momentum outruns structure. When visibility grows faster than trust. When a league built to survive quietly is suddenly forced to perform on the biggest stage before it's ready. What looked like a breakthrough may have been a warning. And the consequences of ignoring that warning are now impossible to avoid. The shift didn't happen slowly. It hit all at once. For years, the WNBA had been fighting for relevance in a crowded sports landscape. Games were played, champions were crowned, and stars came and went, often without the national attention the league believed it deserved. Then suddenly, the volume turned all the way up. This season didn't feel like steady growth. It felt like an explosion. Arenas that once relied on promotions to fill seats were now selling out weeks in advance. Road games became events. Entire cities adjusted their schedules around tip-off times. Television broadcasts pulled in viewers who had never watched a women's basketball game before, and they didn't just sample the product, they stayed. The rookie class played a massive role in that shift. These weren't just talented players. They were cultural magnets. They brought college fan bases with them, social media attention, and a level of visibility the league had never experienced in such a compressed window of time. Every game felt like a measuring stick. Every matchup felt bigger than the standings. From the outside, it finally looked like validation. Sponsors noticed. Media noticed. Ownership groups noticed. Expansion conversations accelerated. New franchises started lining up, willing to pay massive fees just to secure a spot in the league's future. For the first time, owning a WNBA team wasn't framed as a long-term passion project. It was framed as an appreciating asset. But inside the league office, the tone was different. Rapid growth didn't create confidence. It created anxiety. Systems that were designed for modest, controlled expansion were suddenly overwhelmed. Travel logistics became more complicated. Security requirements increased overnight. Marketing budgets ballooned to keep up with demand. Expectations multiplied faster than the infrastructure supporting them. And that pressure landed squarely on the players. They were the ones performing under the brightest lights. They were the faces driving ticket sales and television numbers. Yet the compensation structure hadn't evolved at the same pace. While fans assumed paychecks were exploding alongside popularity, many players were still operating under tight financial constraints that hadn't meaningfully changed. That mismatch mattered. Because once players realize that attention doesn't automatically translate into security, questions start forming. Quiet ones at first, then louder ones. Why does the league feel richer than ever, yet the people creating the value feel stuck? Why does success look different depending on where you're standing? Those questions didn't disappear after the season ended. They lingered. And they would soon force a confrontation the league wasn't prepared for. That's when the narrative cracked. As the season's success dominated headlines, a very different story began circulating quietly behind the scenes. Despite the packed arenas, viral moments, and record-breaking engagement, reports emerged claiming the league was on track to lose tens of millions of dollars in a single year. Not a small deficit. Not a manageable dip. A number so large it immediately raised eyebrows across the sport. To the people watching from the outside, it made no sense. Revenue had clearly jumped. Sponsorships were bigger. Media partners were paying more. Merchandise sales were surging. Expansion teams were writing massive checks just to get in the door. By every visible metric, the league looked healthier than it ever had. And yet, executives were telling a completely different story. One centered on losses, risk, and financial instability. The explanations came quickly. Costs had risen, they said. Travel was more expensive. Charter flights were introduced to address safety concerns. Security budgets ballooned as visibility increased. Marketing spending surged to capitalize on momentum. All of those things were true. But critics inside and outside the league started asking the uncomfortable question. Even with higher expenses, how does the math still look this bad? That's when suspicion replaced confusion. Because in professional sports, timing matters. And this financial narrative didn't surface randomly. It emerged just as labor negotiations were approaching. Just as players were beginning to question their share of the value. Just as leverage started to shift. To veterans of sports business, the pattern was familiar. Emphasize losses. Stress uncertainty. Frame growth as fragile. It's a classic move when ownership wants to slow rising expectations. The players weren't blind to it. They didn't need access to internal ledgers to feel the disconnect. They were playing in front of 18,000 fans. They were driving national conversations. They were seeing franchise valuations climb quietly in the background. And yet, their own financial reality hadn't changed in proportion to the attention they were generating. That gap became impossible to ignore. Because while the league argued poverty, ownership groups were watching their assets appreciate. Teams were becoming more valuable simply by existing in a hotter market. Expansion fees were pouring in. Long-term equity was growing. Just not for the people on the court. To the players, it felt like success was being captured everywhere except where the work was actually happening. That's where trust started to fracture. Once players stop believing the financial story being told, patience disappears. Promises of future growth stop carrying weight. Wait your turn stops sounding reasonable when the turn never seems to arrive. The league wasn't just asking athletes to accept tight salaries anymore. It was asking them to believe a version of reality that didn't match what they were experiencing. And when belief collapses, the conversation changes. It stops being about budgeting. It becomes about power. That's when the players stopped hinting. They acted. Quietly, but decisively, the Players' Association pulled the lever that changes everything in professional sports. The opt-out. To fans, it sounded like legal jargon. To the league, it was a flashing red warning light. Because an opt-out doesn't mean a disagreement. It means the contract holding the entire system together is being torn up on purpose. In simple terms, the players served notice. They were no longer willing to operate under an agreement that no longer reflected the reality of the league. The collective bargaining agreement wasn't just expiring naturally, it was being rejected. And once that happens, the clock starts ticking. If a new deal isn't reached by the deadline, the league doesn't pause. It locks out. No games. No practices. No salaries. No season. This wasn't a bluff. Players don't opt out casually, especially in a league without massive financial cushions. Doing so means betting on leverage instead of security. It means believing the moment is strong enough, the visibility is high enough, and the risk is worth it. The players believed all three were finally true. From their perspective, waiting had failed. They had waited through low ratings. They had waited through empty arenas. They had waited through years of promises about growth and future upside. Now the growth was here, and the upside still wasn't reaching them. The opt-out wasn't just about money. It was about control. About refusing to operate inside a system where revenue only mattered once the league declared itself profitable, something it had claimed it hadn't been for decades. Under that structure, players could help grow the business endlessly and still never share meaningfully in the rewards. That realization hardened positions quickly. To the league, the opt-out felt reckless. Executives warned about sustainability, about thin margins, about how fragile the ecosystem still was. They argued that pushing too hard, too fast could collapse the entire operation. From their viewpoint, patience wasn't exploitation, it was survival. But the players saw it differently. They saw leverage slipping if they didn't act now. Attention is fleeting. Fans move on. Media cycles shift. If they didn't force the issue at the peak of visibility, when would they ever get another chance? This wasn't just a negotiation window. It felt like a once-in-a-generation moment. That's what made the standoff so dangerous. Both sides believed they were acting rationally. Both sides believed the other was misreading reality. And neither side wanted to blink first. Because once an opt-out happens, there's no quiet resolution. There's only confrontation. Once the opt-out became public, the conversation stopped being polite. Players made their position clear without shouting. They pointed to the evidence everyone could see. Packed arenas, prime-time broadcasts, surging merchandise sales, expansion fees climbing into record territory. From their perspective, the case was simple. The product was finally working, and the people creating that value deserved a share that reflected reality. The message wasn't complicated. They weren't demanding instant riches. They weren't asking to be paid like NBA superstars. They were asking for alignment. Alignment between growth and compensation. Between visibility and security. Between what the league celebrated publicly and what it practiced privately. The league responded with a very different message. Executives pushed back hard, arguing that the business still wasn't stable. Yes, revenue had increased, but so had expenses. They emphasized that growth doesn't equal profit, especially for a league still investing heavily in infrastructure. Travel, marketing, security, staffing, and operations had all ballooned in response to the spotlight. From their point of view, the money players were pointing at was already spoken for. To the league, this wasn't greed. It was math. They warned that moving too aggressively could put the entire operation at risk. That a dramatic shift in revenue sharing before the league reached consistent profitability could turn short-term momentum into long-term collapse. The argument was framed as responsibility versus impatience. But that framing didn't land with players. Because what they were hearing sounded familiar. They had heard it for years. Not yet. Almost there. Just wait a little longer. Growth was always presented as something just around the corner, and once it arrived, the rules seemed to change again. From the player's perspective, the finish line kept moving. That's where the standoff hardened. Players believed the league was downplaying success to protect ownership margins. The league believed players were underestimating financial risk. Each side accused the other of ignoring reality. And neither side trusted the numbers being shared. The core issue wasn't salary caps or percentages anymore. It was credibility. If the league truly didn't have the money, players wanted transparency. If the money did exist, they wanted access. Without trust, even reasonable compromises felt dangerous. This is the moment negotiations usually fall apart. Not because the demands are impossible, but because both sides believe giving in first would mean admitting they were wrong. And in professional sports, pride can be just as expensive as payroll. There was one factor that made this entire fight more dangerous than it looked on the surface. The NBA. For decades, the WNBA hadn't operated in isolation. It survived, stabilized, and expanded with the financial backing of the men's league. The NBA didn't just support it symbolically, it subsidized it. Quietly, consistently, and without much public debate. Roughly 60% of the league's ownership structure tied back to the NBA, making it both a partner and a lifeline. That relationship changed the stakes of everything. As long as the NBA was willing to absorb losses, the WNBA could afford patience. Growth didn't need to be immediately profitable. Long-term vision mattered more than short-term balance sheets. But insiders began suggesting that this dynamic was shifting. Media landscapes were changing. Broadcast deals were being renegotiated. Owners were looking harder at where their money was going and what returns they were actually seeing. And patience, even among billionaires, has limits. Rumors started circulating that NBA ownership was growing restless. Not hostile, just colder. The expectation was no longer indefinite support. It was self-sufficiency. The message, according to people close to the situation, was simple. Growth is great, but losses can't be permanent. That put the WNBA in a brutal position. If the league was truly losing tens of millions annually, as executives claimed, and the NBA decided to tighten the financial leash, the math became unforgiving. Subsidies that once smoothed over deficits could disappear. And without that safety net, the idea of an indefinite shutdown stopped sounding like a negotiation tactic and started sounding like a contingency plan. From the players' perspective, this was terrifying. They were demanding more at the exact moment the parent organization might be demanding less spending. It looked like a collision course. Players assumed the NBA wouldn't allow the league to fail because of the public backlash it would cause. But corporate loyalty has limits too, especially when losses start affecting other priorities. And that's the part fans rarely consider. In billion-dollar businesses, public relations matter, until they don't. Eventually, spreadsheets outrank sentiment. If leadership at the top decided the WNBA had to stand on its own immediately, the leverage equation flipped overnight. Suddenly, the league wasn't negotiating from a position of patience. It was negotiating under pressure. This is what turned the opt-out into a gamble. The players were betting the NBA wouldn't pull the plug. The league was betting the players wouldn't risk total collapse. And hovering above both sides was a silent question no one wanted to answer out loud. What happens if the safety net disappears right when everyone needs it most? The season wasn't just louder. It was heavier. As attention poured into the league, the environment around it changed in ways few people were prepared for. New fans arrived in waves, many of them passionate, emotional, and deeply invested in individual players rather than the league as a whole. That shift brought energy, but it also brought friction. Narratives hardened quickly. Old guard versus new guard. Veterans versus rookies. Respect versus hype. Every hard foul was dissected. Every facial expression became evidence. Online debates spilled into real life, and what started as sports discussion turned personal fast. Players found themselves at the center of conversations they never asked to be part of, dealing with scrutiny that went far beyond basketball. The harassment wasn't theoretical. Athletes spoke openly about receiving threats, about being followed, about feeling unsafe in public spaces they once moved through comfortably. Airports became stressful. Hotels required added security. Social media, which had once been a tool for promotion, became a constant source of anxiety. And the league struggled to respond. Policies lagged behind reality. Protection mechanisms weren't built for this scale of attention. The infrastructure that managed player safety and public engagement simply wasn't designed for a moment this intense. As pressure mounted, the emotional toll on players grew heavier by the week. This mattered for more than optics. When you combine a hostile environment with a financial dispute, burnout accelerates. Players start asking whether the spotlight is worth the cost, whether fame without security is actually progress, and whether staying inside the system makes sense when alternatives exist. Security costs rose. Mental health concerns became unavoidable. The league cited these expenses as further proof of financial strain. Players saw them as consequences of success they were never fully compensated for. That difference in interpretation widened the gap even further. Because from the players' side, the equation was simple. If the league wanted them to absorb the risks of visibility, the league needed to absorb the responsibility of protection and pay. Exposure without support stopped feeling like opportunity and started feeling like exploitation. And once players begin questioning whether the system is worth staying in, the conversation shifts again. It stops being about fixing the league. it becomes about leaving it. For the first time, the threat wasn't just theoretical. Players had options. For decades, the WNBA operated with a quiet assumption. If you wanted to play at the highest level, this was the league. Even when pay was low and seasons were short, there was nowhere else to go. That assumption no longer held. As the standoff escalated, alternative paths started looking less like backup plans and more like leverage. One of those paths changed the conversation entirely. A new 3-on-3 league, designed by players for players, began circulating as a serious alternative. Shorter seasons, centralized locations, significantly higher pay relative to time commitment, and most importantly, equity. Players weren't just participants, they were stakeholders. That detail mattered more than anything. Equity meant ownership. Ownership meant long-term security. Security meant freedom. For players exhausted by travel, harassment, and financial uncertainty, the appeal was obvious. A few months of competition could generate what some WNBA contracts paid over an entire year. The travel was controlled. The environment was curated. And the power structure was flipped. This wasn't rebellion. It was leverage. The mere existence of a viable alternative changed negotiations instantly. It sent a message the league couldn't ignore. Players were no longer trapped. If talks collapsed, some athletes were prepared to walk away and let the league deal with the consequences. From the league's perspective, this was terrifying. Star power drives attention. If recognizable faces disappear, momentum collapses. Broadcast partners lose interest. Sponsors hesitate. Fans drift. The league wasn't just negotiating with players anymore. It was negotiating with time. And the risk went both ways. Walking away from the WNBA carried consequences too. Legacy mattered. Visibility mattered. Cultural relevance mattered. But for players who had already absorbed years of risk with limited reward, the balance was shifting. Staying no longer felt like the safer choice. That's when the idea of an indefinite shutdown stopped sounding exaggerated. If enough players chose alternatives, a lockout wouldn't just pause the league. It would drain it. And rebuilding from that kind of exodus isn't guaranteed, no matter how strong the brand once looked. The exit door was no longer hidden. It was wide open. Not everyone had the same leverage. While stars could afford to wait, the middle of the league lived in a very different reality. The superstars had endorsement deals, signature shoes, national campaigns, and financial cushions that could absorb a missed season. If the league shut down, they would still be visible, still marketable, still secure. But the majority of players weren't in that position. They were the 7th and 8th players in the rotation. The rookies trying to stick. The veterans fighting for one more contract. For them, the WNBA wasn't a branding platform. It was their livelihood. A lockout didn't mean delayed negotiations. It meant rent. It meant medical bills. It meant careers hanging in the balance. This is where unity becomes fragile. Unions rely on collective strength, but collective strength is hardest to maintain when sacrifices aren't shared equally. The longer a shutdown lasts, the more pressure builds on players who can't afford to wait it out. Ownership understands this dynamic well. It's why prolonged standoffs often turn into psychological wars rather than financial ones. Divide the room. Offer selective concessions. Test loyalty. The league could offer small raises or short-term guarantees that help the majority while avoiding the larger structural changes stars were pushing for. Or it could do the opposite. Appease the top tier while leaving role players exposed. Either approach risks fracturing the union from the inside. And the players know it. That's why leadership within the Players Association has been so deliberate. Keeping everyone aligned requires constant communication and shared purpose. One fracture could collapse leverage overnight. If enough players feel the pain outweighs the promise, pressure to settle, even on unfavorable terms, becomes overwhelming. This internal tension rarely makes headlines. Fans see stars. Executives see percentages. But inside locker rooms, conversations are more personal. Who can afford to wait? Who can't? How long is too long? That uncertainty weighs heavily as deadlines approach. Because even if players believe they're right, belief doesn't pay bills. And the longer the league stays dark, the harder it becomes to convince everyone that the sacrifice will be worth it. This isn't just a battle between players and owners. It's a test of how much solidarity can survive when the cost keeps rising. The damage wouldn't stop at the professional level. If the WNBA goes dark, the shockwaves travel backward through the entire system of women's basketball. College programs would feel it first. For years, the WNBA has been the clear destination at the end of the pipeline. You play in college, you get drafted, you turn pro. That path suddenly looks unstable. And instability changes decisions. With NIL money reshaping college sports, elite players are no longer in a rush to leave campus. Some are already earning more in college than they would as professional rookies. Add the threat of a shutdown, and declaring for the draft becomes a gamble instead of a milestone. Why rush into a league that might not have a season? That hesitation could freeze the talent flow. Top prospects staying in college longer means weaker draft classes. Weaker draft classes mean less excitement. Less excitement means lower engagement. It becomes a feedback loop that slowly drains momentum from the pro game while the amateur level absorbs the attention. International leagues would feel it too. Players who rely on overseas contracts for income would be forced back into that cycle. The same risks, the same instability, the same safety concerns the league has spent years trying to move away from. A shutdown doesn't pause careers, it redirects them, often into less secure environments. Sponsors and broadcasters wouldn't wait around either. Corporate money follows certainty. If schedules become unreliable, budgets shift elsewhere. Attention moves fast in modern sports. What disappears for a season doesn't automatically return the next. Fans build new habits. Media fills airtime with something else. The vacuum doesn't stay empty. And then there's the cultural impact. This season brought millions of new fans into women's basketball for the first time. Many of them arrived because the product felt urgent, emotional, and alive. A shutdown risks turning that moment into a footnote. Remember when, instead of a foundation. That's what makes this moment so fragile. The league is standing at the peak of visibility, with more eyes watching than ever before. But visibility without continuity doesn't build loyalty. It builds curiosity, and curiosity fades quickly when there's nothing to watch. If the WNBA disappears even temporarily, the question isn't whether it can return. It's whether the audience will wait. This is the moment everything comes to a head. The WNBA is no longer fighting to be noticed. That battle is over. The league won it. The arenas are full. The broadcasts are drawing numbers. The players are household names. In many ways, this is exactly what everyone said they wanted for decades. And yet, this success has exposed every weakness at once. The players believe they finally have leverage, and they're using it. They're done waiting. Done trusting vague promises about the future. Done accepting that growth somehow never reaches the people creating it. From their perspective, this is the only window where real change is possible. If they don't push now, they may never get another chance. The league, meanwhile, is staring at a different reality. Executives see rising costs, thin margins, and a financial structure that still depends heavily on outside support. They see risk where players see opportunity. They fear that moving too fast could undo everything they've built. And with pressure from ownership above them, the room for compromise feels smaller every day. That's how you end up here. An immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. Players refusing to back down. Owners refusing to overcommit. The opt-out is real. The shutdown threat is real. What isn't clear is whether the league can survive the collision. If a deal isn't reached, this won't look like a temporary pause. Stadiums will sit empty. Broadcast windows will be filled with something else. Fans who just arrived may quietly drift away. And when the lights finally come back on, if they do, the league will not look the same. Roster rules will change. Salary structures will change. Some teams may not survive the reset. Even if basketball returns, the version fans knew might be gone. This is the harsh truth about professional sports. Passion doesn't pay bills. Growth doesn't automatically mean security. And success, when it arrives too fast, can be just as dangerous as failure. The players know their value now, and they refuse to pretend otherwise. The owners are protecting their investments and refusing to gamble recklessly. Neither side is wrong, but both are risking everything. As the next season approaches, every game will feel different. Every highlight will carry uncertainty. Every celebration will be shadowed by the possibility that this might be the last time we see this version of the league for a long while. The real battle isn't happening on the court. It's happening in boardrooms, between lawyers and accountants, while the clock keeps ticking. And right now, no one knows who will blink first. If you're still watching, it means you care about where this league is headed, and conversations like this matter more than ever right now. If you want deeper breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Like the video if this helped you understand the situation more clearly, and leave a comment with where you stand. Player leverage or league stability. The future of the WNBA is being decided in real time. And this story is far from over.